Let me start by saying this wasn't supposed to be a story. It was just life, you know. The kind of everyday stuff that blends into the background until one day it doesn't. Until one day, your quiet little world explodes because someone decided your driveway gate was *too offensive for their delicate sensibilities. It all started with what I thought was a harmless improvement, a new automatic driveway gate. Ethan and I had been talking about it for months. Our cul-de-sac at Maplewood Lane wasn't exactly bustling with traffic, but we'd noticed more cars cutting through late at night. Headlights would slice through our bedroom curtains, waking us up. Then there were the occasional package thieves lurking around, stealing deliveries right off our porch. So when we finally saved up enough money, we splurged on a sleek black wrought iron gate with a keypad entry system. The installer finished on a Friday afternoon. As he drove away, I stood in the driveway, admiring our handiwork. The gate looked elegant, modern, and secure. It wasn't flashy or over the top, just simple and functional. Ethan walked out with 2 glasses of lemonade, handing me one. "Looks great," he said, raising his glass. "To peace of mind." Little did I know, peace of mind would be the last thing we'd get. By Sunday evening, everything changed. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when I heard raised voices outside. At first, I assumed it was kids playing or maybe a dog barking too loudly. But then there was a sharp knock at the door. Loud, insistent. When I opened it, Karen from across the street stood there, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they almost disappeared. She wore her signature oversized sunglasses, even though the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. Behind her loomed Officer Martinez, clipboard in hand. "Do you realize you're obstructing public access?" Karen snapped before I could even say hello. Her tone was accusatory, like I'd personally insulted her family crest. "What are you talking about?" I asked, blinking in confusion. "This." She pointed dramatically at my shiny new gate. "You've closed off part of the roadway. That's against city code." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Obstructing public access. City code. My mind raced as I tried to process her words. We'd double-checked everything before installing the gate. It was entirely within our property line, and we'd even consulted with the city to ensure it complied with local regulations. How could this possibly be an issue? Officer Martinez stepped forward, looking apologetic but firm. "Ma'am, we received a complaint that your gate extends into the public right-of-way. We'll need to measure it to confirm compliance." My stomach sank. Public right-of-way. What was she talking about? Still, I nodded numbly and let them do their job. As they measured, Karen hovered nearby, smirking like she'd just won some cosmic battle. Every time I glanced at her, she gave me this self-satisfied look, like she'd already declared victory. When the officer finally announced that the gate was indeed compliant with city codes, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But Karen didn't seem fazed. She huffed and stormed off without another word, muttering something under her breath. As I watched her retreating figure, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the events in my mind, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about a gate. It was about control. About someone thinking they had the right to dictate how I lived my life, even on my own property. And if Karen thought she could push me around, she was in for a rude awakening. The next day, I woke up determined to put the whole Karen incident behind me. After all, the gate was legal, and Officer Martinez had confirmed it. What more could she possibly do? I told myself that maybe Karen would cool off after her little tantrum. Maybe she'd realize how ridiculous she was being and leave us alone. But deep down, I knew better. People like Karen don't just let things go. They thrive on drama, on making everything about them. By Monday morning, my suspicions were confirmed. An envelope bearing the dreaded HOA logo appeared in our mailbox. My stomach churned as I tore it open, dreading what I'd find inside. Sure enough, it was a formal notice. Dear Ms. Umi, we have received multiple complaints regarding your recent installation of a driveway gate. While initial measurements indicate compliance with city codes, the structure violates Section 4.7 of the Maplewood Lane HOA Guidelines, which prohibits any permanent obstructions visible from the street. Failure to remedy this issue within 30 days will result in fines and potential legal action. Asterisk. I read it 3 times, each pass making me angrier than the last. Permanent obstructions, visible from the street. Who cared if it was visible? It was functional, beautiful, and completely within our rights as homeowners. Why should I have to rip it out just because someone didn't like the way it looked? Ethan found me pacing the living room, the letter clutched in my fist. "What now?" he asked cautiously. "I don't know," I muttered, sinking onto the couch. "But I'm not taking this lying down." That evening, I called the HOA office to get some clarity. The woman who answered sounded bored, like she'd dealt with 100 similar calls that week. When I explained the situation, she sighed heavily and said, "Look, the rules are the rules. If you want to contest it, you'll need to attend the next meeting and present your case." "Present my case," I repeated, incredulous. "For a driveway gate?" "Yes," she replied flatly. "And make sure you bring documentation. Photos, permits, anything that proves compliance." I hung up feeling frustrated but also oddly motivated. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. Over the next few days, Ethan and I gathered every piece of evidence we could think of. Photos of the gate, copies of the permit, even emails from the city confirming its legality. We weren't just prepared. We were ready to prove that this wasn't about violating rules. It was about bullying people into submission. The day of the meeting finally arrived, and I walked into the community center feeling a mix of nerves and determination. The room was filled with familiar faces, though none of them seemed particularly eager to meet my gaze. Mrs. Whittaker, the HOA president, sat at the front, looking every bit the queen of her tiny kingdom. Her platinum bob gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her voice carried an authority that made everyone sit up straighter when she spoke. Karen, of course, was there too, seated near the front with a smug expression plastered across her face. She gave me a pointed look as I took my seat, as if to say, "Asterisk, you're wasting your time." Asterisk, but I refused to let her intimidate me. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my home, and for the principle that no one gets to dictate how I live my life. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and laid out my case calmly but firmly. I showed them photos of the gate, explained how it improved security and privacy, and reminded them that it complied with city codes. But no matter how logical my arguments were, the board dismissed them with vague references to neighborhood harmony and visual consistency. Karen chimed in repeatedly, her voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't about legality," she sneered. "It's about preserving the integrity of our community." Her words hit me like a slap. Integrity. Wasn't it integrity to protect your home and family? To make improvements that enhanced safety and privacy? Apparently not in Karen's twisted worldview. As the meeting dragged on, I realized something crucial. This wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about power. And Karen, and the HOA, weren't going to back down without a fight. After the meeting, I left the community center feeling more frustrated than ever. It wasn't just the HOA's refusal to listen. It was the way they dismissed my concerns like they didn't matter. Like asterisk I asterisk didn't matter. I couldn't shake the image of Karen smirking from her seat, as if she'd already won. It made me angry, not just at her, but at myself for letting her get under my skin. That night, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter from the HOA. The deadline loomed over us. 30 days to remedy the situation or face fines. But how could we fix something that wasn't broken? Taking down the gate wasn't an option. It had cost us a small fortune, not to mention the peace of mind it brought. We needed another solution. The next morning, I decided to talk to some of our neighbors. Maybe they'd understand where I was coming from. After all, we weren't the only ones who dealt with Karen's antics. Surely someone else had been pushed around by the HOA at some point. My first stop was Leela and Greg's house, 2 doors down. They were known for their vegetable garden, which had sparked its own controversy with the HOA last year. When I knocked on their door, Leela greeted me with a warm smile. "Hey, Umi. What's up?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to start. "Do you have time to chat?" "About?" "Well, the HOA." Her expression shifted instantly. "Oh no. What happened now?" I explained the whole situation, the gate, Karen's complaints, the HOA's unreasonable demands. Lila listened intently, nodding along. When I finished, she sighed. "You're not the first person this has happened to," she said. "Last year, they gave us grief about our garden because it disrupted the aesthetic. Can you believe that?" Greg joined us then, shaking his head. "They're impossible," he said, "but if we stick together, maybe we can push back." Their words gave me hope. If other people felt the same way, maybe we could do something about it. Together, we came up with an idea, a petition. Not just for my gate, but for everyone who'd been affected by the HOA's strict rules. We wanted to show them that the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of identical houses. It was a community of real people with real lives. Over the next few days, I went door to door, talking to as many neighbors as I could. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation from the HOA. Others agreed wholeheartedly, sharing stories of their own struggles. One couple told me they'd been fined for painting their front door a shade of blue that wasn't approved. Another neighbor confessed she'd been too scared to install solar panels because of the HOA's restrictions. Despite the occasional resistance, support grew quickly. By the end of the week, nearly half the neighborhood had signed the petition. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could make a difference. But hope is fragile, especially when pitted against people like Karen. When she caught wind of the petition, she retaliated with a vengeance. She started filing additional complaints, not just about the gate, but about everything. She claimed our mailbox was crooked. It wasn't. That our bushes were overgrown. They were perfectly trimmed. And even accused us of parking our car in a way that blocked visibility. We hadn't. Each complaint came with a fresh wave of stress, forcing us to defend ourselves again and again. Karen also spread rumors around the neighborhood, whispering behind closed doors about how I was difficult and disruptive. At first it hurt. Hearing those words repeated back to me made me question whether I was being unreasonable. Was I causing trouble for nothing? But then I reminded myself why I was doing this. This wasn't about me. It was about fairness, about standing up for what was right. As the tension escalated, I realized something important. Karen thrived on chaos. She fed off conflict, using fear and intimidation to keep people in line. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Every time she tried to knock me down, I stood taller. And slowly but surely, others began to notice. Neighbors who had once stayed silent started speaking up, sharing their frustrations and adding their names to the petition. Even those who hadn't signed offered quiet words of encouragement, thanking me for having the courage to fight back. Karen may have thought she was winning, but deep down, I knew the tide was turning. This wasn't just my battle anymore. It belonged to all of us. And together, we were stronger than anyone could have imagined. As the days passed, the tension in Maplewood Lane grew thicker than the summer heat. Karen's constant complaints and rumors started to wear on everyone, including me. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down, making even the simplest tasks feel exhausting. But at the same time, something unexpected began to happen. People started talking, really talking. At first, it was subtle. A neighbor would stop by while I was watering the plants or walking the dog and casually mention how ridiculous the HOA rules had become. Others would nod in agreement during casual conversations at the mailbox or over coffee. It was like a dam had cracked open, letting out years of pent-up frustration that no one had dared to voice before. And as more neighbors joined our cause, the petition gained momentum. But with every signature came pushback from Karen and her allies. She wasn't alone in her crusade against me, or us, rather. There were others on the HOA board who clung to the old ways, terrified of change or losing control. They dismissed the petition as unnecessary disruption, accusing us of trying to undermine the neighborhood's harmony. Harmony. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at that word. How could there be harmony when half the neighborhood felt stifled and silenced? One evening, Ethan and I attended another HOA meeting. This time, though, we weren't alone. Nearly a dozen neighbors showed up to support us, including Leela and Greg. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Mrs. Whittaker called the meeting to order. Her polished smile faltered slightly when she saw the turnout, but she quickly regained her composure. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, holding the petition tightly in my hands. My heart pounded as I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors, some curious, some skeptical, and others quietly rooting for me. Taking a deep breath, I began. I'm here today because this isn't just about a driveway gate anymore, I said, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my stomach. It's about fairness, about being able to make decisions for our own homes without fear of retaliation. We followed every rule, every guideline, and yet we're still told we're wrong. I held up the petition, its pages filled with signatures. These aren't just names. They're real people. Families. Neighbors who want to live their lives without being micromanaged. Who believe that having a safe, secure home shouldn't come with a side of harassment. The room fell silent. Even Karen seemed momentarily stunned into silence. For once, her usual smugness wavered. Mrs. Whittaker cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. We appreciate your concerns, she said stiffly. But these guidelines exist for a reason, to protect property values and maintain consistency. Consistency. Leela chimed in, her tone sharp. You mean conformity. You're so worried about everything looking the same that you forget we're actual human beings living here, not mannequins in a display window. Her words earned murmurs of agreement from several attendees. One man spoke up, sharing how he'd been fined for planting flowers that weren't on the HOA's approved list. Another woman recounted how she'd been scolded for putting up holiday decorations too early. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning what had started as my personal battle into a collective movement. Karen tried to counter, her voice shrill as she accused us of ruining the neighborhood. But her words carried less weight now. People were listening, to each other, not to her. By the end of the meeting, the board reluctantly agreed to revisit the guidelines, promising to consider our concerns. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was progress. That night, as Ethan and I walked home, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I truly believed we might win. Together, we were proving that standing up for ourselves didn't divide us, it brought us closer. And that, more than anything, gave me hope. The days following that pivotal HOA meeting felt like a turning point, but not in the way I'd expected. While some neighbors celebrated the board's reluctant promise to reconsider the rules, others remained cautious or outright hostile. Karen, predictably, wasn't ready to back down. If anything, her determination to protect Maplewood Lane from my so-called chaos only intensified. It started with small things at first, petty annoyances designed to wear me down. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes taped to our mailbox. Such a shame about those overgrown bushes, or hope your car isn't blocking anyone today. Each note was written in her neat, precise handwriting, as if she wanted to make sure I knew exactly who they were from. At first, I laughed them off, tossing them straight into the trash without giving them another thought. But after a while, the constant stream of criticism began to grate on me. It wasn't just the words, it was the intent behind them. Karen didn't care about property values or aesthetics, she cared about control. And she wouldn't stop until she got it. Then came the Saturday morning showdown. Ethan and I had plans to visit the farmer's market, a weekly tradition we both looked forward to. The air smelled fresh, and the sun cast golden light across the cul-de-sac as we stepped outside. But before we could even reach the gate, we saw her standing there, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose, blocking our exit like some self-appointed gatekeeper. "You think you can ignore the rules?" she spat, glaring at me. Her tone was sharp, accusatory, like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Are you seriously trying to prevent me from leaving my own driveway?" She didn't budge. Instead, she whipped out her phone and dialed the police. Again. This time, though, Officer Martinez seemed less sympathetic. After listening to both sides and seeing that our gate posed no actual obstruction, he politely suggested Karen step aside and avoid further confrontations. Humiliated, she slunk away, muttering under her breath, "This isn't over." But it was over. For her, at least. That incident became the tipping point for many of our neighbors. What had once been whispered frustrations turned into open defiance. People stopped tiptoeing around Karen and the HOA board, realizing they didn't have to live in fear anymore. One by one, they started speaking up, not just about my gate, but about all the ridiculous restrictions that had made their lives harder. Leela and Greg took the lead, organizing informal gatherings where neighbors could share ideas for reforming the HOA guidelines. These weren't official meetings. They were casual get-togethers held in driveways and backyards, complete with lemonade and cookies. The atmosphere was warm and supportive, a stark contrast to the cold formality of the HOA meetings. For the first time, people felt heard. Karen tried to sabotage these efforts, of course. She spread more rumors, accusing us of forming a rebel group determined to destroy the neighborhood. But her words carried little weight now. Most people saw through her tactics, recognizing them for what they were: desperate attempts to cling to power. Even some of her former allies began distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged into her drama. As momentum built, I noticed a shift, not just in attitudes, but in actions. Neighbors who had once hesitated to sign the petition now proudly added their names. Others volunteered to help draft new proposals for the HOA board, outlining reasonable compromises that balanced individual freedom with community standards. Together, we created a vision for Maplewood Lane that reflected who we truly were: diverse, independent, and united. Looking back, I realized something important. Karen hadn't brought us together. She'd forced us apart. Her need for control had alienated her from the very people she claimed to protect. In fighting against her, we'd found common ground. And though the battle wasn't over yet, I knew we were stronger than ever. The final showdown came sooner than any of us expected. The HOA called an emergency meeting, citing urgent matters that needed to be addressed. When Ethan and I arrived at the community center, the room was packed, far more crowded than usual. Neighbors filled every seat, some standing along the walls or spilling into the hallway. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just another meeting. It felt like Judgment Day. Karen sat near the front, flanked by her loyal supporters on the board. She wore her trademark oversized sunglasses, even though the room was dimly lit, as if trying to shield herself from the growing tide of dissent. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. For once, she didn't look smug. She looked cornered. Mrs. Whittaker opened the meeting with her usual polished demeanor, but there was an edge to her voice. "We're here today to discuss recent concerns raised by several residents regarding HOA guidelines," she began, glancing pointedly at me. "Let's keep this civil." I nodded, taking a deep breath. It was my turn to speak again, and this time I wasn't alone. As I stood up, I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me, but also their support. My neighbors weren't just watching. They were rooting for me. That knowledge gave me strength. "This isn't about one person or one gate," I started, my voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach. "It's about fairness. about being able to live in our homes without fear of retaliation for making reasonable decisions. We've followed the rules, paid our dues, and yet we're still treated like children who need constant supervision. I held up the petition again, its pages thick with signatures. These aren't just names. They're voices. Voices asking for change. Voices demanding respect. One by one, others stood to share their stories. Layla talked about how the HOA had made her feel ashamed for planting vegetables instead of ornamental flowers. Greg recounted how he'd been fined for painting his mailbox a color that didn't match the aesthetic. Even quieter neighbors found the courage to speak, sharing tales of frustration and helplessness. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning what had started as my personal battle into a collective cry for reform. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shrill as she accused us of undermining the neighborhood's values. But her words fell flat. People shook their heads, rolling their eyes or outright ignoring her. For the first time, she was losing her grip, and she knew it. Finally, Mrs. Whittaker called for a vote. The board proposed revising certain guidelines, allowing for reasonable modifications to driveways, landscaping, and exterior designs, as long as they met basic safety standards. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was progress. And when the votes were tallied, the majority sided with us. The room erupted in applause, cheers echoing off the walls. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she might fall apart at any moment. Without a word, she gathered her things and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Afterward, as Ethan and I walked home, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The fight hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. Together, we'd stood up to someone who thought she could control us. And we'd won. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone in Maplewood Lane. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. Karen wasn't the villain of this story. She was a symptom of something bigger, a system that valued control over community. By challenging her, we'd challenged that system, and in doing so, we'd reclaimed not just our freedom, but our neighborhood soul. In the weeks that followed the meeting, life in Maplewood Lane began to change, not dramatically, but noticeably. The revised guidelines gave homeowners more freedom to make decisions about their properties without fear of fines or backlash. People started painting their front doors bold colors, planting vegetable gardens, and adding personal touches that made each house feel unique. It was refreshing, like the neighborhood had finally taken a deep breath after holding it for years. Karen's absence was felt almost immediately. She didn't attend any more HOA meetings, and her once perfect lawn grew patchy and unkempt. Rumors swirled that she put her house on the market, though no one knew for sure. Eventually, a moving truck pulled up to her house one Saturday morning, and by evening, the for sale sign was gone. Whether she left out of guilt, frustration, or sheer exhaustion, I'll never know. But honestly, I didn't care. Her departure wasn't a victory. It was a reminder of how far we'd come. With Karen gone, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Conversations at mailboxes turned friendly again. Kids played freely in the cul-de-sacs, their laughter echoing through the streets. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved hello and stopped to chat. Even Mrs. Whittaker seemed different, less rigid, more willing to listen. At the next HOA meeting, she opened with a heartfelt apology, acknowledging past mistakes and promising transparency moving forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And sometimes, progress is all you can ask for. As for me, I learned lessons I'll carry with me forever. Standing up to Karen taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. That fight, the sleepless nights, the endless arguments, the moments when I doubted myself, had changed me. I felt stronger, braver, and more connected to my community than ever before. Ethan noticed the difference too. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he said, "You've always been tough, but this whole thing, it brought something out in you, something amazing." I smiled, leaning into him. It's not just me. We did this together, all of us. If it weren't for everyone stepping up, nothing would have changed. That was the truth. This wasn't my story alone. It belonged to every neighbor who signed the petition, spoke up at meetings, or simply refused to stay silent anymore. Together, we proved that standing up for ourselves didn't divide us, it united us. Looking back, I realized the real villain wasn't Karen, or even the HOA. It was fear. Fear of rocking the boat, of standing out, of losing control. But sometimes, breaking free of those fears is worth the fight. Because in the end, home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's where you feel safe, respected, and truly yourself. And thanks to that ugly chapter in my life, I learned to cherish that freedom more than ever. My driveway gate still stands proudly today, a symbol not just of security, but of resilience. Whenever I see it, I'm reminded of everything we went through, and everything we gained. Maplewood Lane may not be perfect, but it's ours, and that makes all the difference.